Famous Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran summarized Lebanon's situation presently well over a century ago. Pity the nation that wears cloth it does not weave, and eats bread it does not harvest. Pity the nation that acclaims the bully as hero, and that deems the glittering conqueror bountiful. Welcome to Lebanon, a country in despair that is barely holding on. GDP, a measure of a nation's output, is now estimated to be $21 billion US, down from $55 billion in 2018. The Lebanese pound has lost 90% of its value, leading to massive inflation and a deterioration in living standards. According to the UN, around 80% of the population within Lebanon is now classed as poor, and more than 50% of families have a child who miss at least one meal a day. A brain drain of the country is well on its way, with its brightest and youngest minds leaving the failed state, frustrated with the lack of infrastructure and opportunity. Electricity is a privilege, with many Lebanese turning to candles for light. A soldier's wage, one of the major sources of employment in Lebanon, was equivalent to $900 US a month before the crisis. It is now a measly $50. Lebanon relies on foreign imported fuel to keep the country moving. Taxi services, referred to as the service, is a popular form of transportation. These costs have blown out from 2,000 Lebanese pounds a trip to 40,000. Banks have stopped withdrawals. Lebanese citizens have been denied their life savings to pay for food, medical bills and education. The country has collapsed, and with it, the spirits of the Lebanese people have been extinguished. What went wrong? How are things so dire? In the 1920s, an Italian swindler promised investors a 50% profit within 45 days or 100% profit within 90 days. He would do this by allegedly buying discounted postal coupons in other countries and redeeming them at face value in the US as a form of arbitrage. New investors flocked in, and for a time, they were earning the promised returns, which led to a wave of fresh investors. It turns out that this swindler was lying. In reality, he was using the money from new investors to pay out returns from the earlier ones. His name was Charles Ponzi, and this type of scam would forever be called the Ponzi scheme. In 2009, the Ponzi scheme would be one of the biggest stories across the globe, when a Bernie Madoff was arrested and sentenced to 150 years for conning investors out of an estimated $20 billion US using the Ponzi strategy. The scam is simple. Promise large returns, pay out investors with the money from new ones, rinse and repeat. Welcome to Economic Truth, where we break down the economics behind our globe. And in this video, we cover the Lebanese Ponzi, the world's greatest ever Ponzi. On August 4th, 2020, the World Bank published a report on Lebanon's economy called Ponzi Finance. In the report, the World Bank lashed out at power brokers in the nation for serving the interests of an entrenched political economy, which instrumentalized state institutions using fiscal and economic tools. During the 1960s, Lebanon's capital Beirut was known as the Paris of the East, playground for the rich and elite from all over the world. This brought with it capital inflows and made Lebanon the banking capital of the Middle East, a significant advantage for the state. In 1975, the country broke out in a grueling civil war based on religious affiliations and sex. It was a multifaceted armed conflict that went on till 1990. It resulted in an estimated 120,000 fatalities and an exodus of almost 1 million people from Lebanon. It shattered the once beautiful nation. Now, to cover this war, we would need a whole separate video. But to understand the great Lebanese Ponzi scheme, we must cover the result of the civil war. The war would end with a TAIF agreement being signed in Saudi Arabia. Syria would occupy Lebanon, and the country would establish a confessionless democratic republic. Confessionalism is a system of government that is a du jour mix of religion and politics. It typically entails distributing political and institutional power proportionally amongst confessional communities. In Lebanon's case, government roles, power, and influence would be spread primarily amongst its three major religious factions. The president would always be a Maronite Catholic, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the house a Shiite Muslim. Department heads, members of parliaments, and legislative would be distributed according to sectarian and religious line. Why is this important? Well, it meant that the Lebanese political system was not geared towards the national interests. Power brokers were more motivated to appease their base, ensuring that their people were rewarded and holding on to their pockets of power. As a result, Lebanon failed to build an economy upon which long-term prosperity could be achieved. Instead of building institutions to take its country forward, it developed the Ponzi scheme, the world's largest. Ponzi schemes rely on new investors. When they begin to dry up, the wheels come falling off. In March 2020, the wheels of the Lebanese Ponzi scheme had truly fallen off. Lebanon would default on $1.2 billion in Eurobond payments due. At the time, they had amassed a total Eurobond obligation of $31.2 billion. The failed state had a total outstanding debt north of $91 billion, amounting to 160% of gross domestic product. But why? How? Let's go back to 1997. In 1997, the Lebanese decided to peg its pound to the US dollar. A currency peg is a policy in which a national government or central bank sets a fixed exchange rate for its currency with the foreign currency or a basket of currencies. The Lebanese pound was pegged at 1,500 per US dollar. This was much higher than it should have been. However, there are advantages to this. It encourages capital inflow into the Lebanese banking sector, as it signals that investments that come in will have the same purchasing power or same value when you get them out. By also pegging, it gave local Lebanese banks the confidence to loan the government the capital it needed for reconstruction. Loans that we will find out they never used. In addition, an artificially high peg increases the purchasing power for the Lebanese people, meaning they could buy more goods and services internationally because of the artificially high value of the Lebanese pound. When you compare households in Lebanon compared to Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt, they in general live better lives because of the artificially high pound. That's why teachers and mid-level managers in Lebanon were able to afford the latest gadgets, a maid, and a Mercedes-Benz. However, it's not as simple as just saying, "Hey world, this is the value of our currency." By setting a high exchange rate, you encourage your citizens and industries to rely on imports because it makes them more cost-effective. What it also does is creates chronic trade deficits, requiring a government to borrow more money. By increasing imports, you also devalue your currency. Let's take a look at a simple example. Ziad owns a hardware store and purchases screws from overseas. Let's say he's buying $10 of screws. Well, he would need the equivalent of 15,000 Lebanese pounds. So Ziad goes to the FX market and sells Lebanese pounds to buy US dollars, creating downward pressure on the Lebanese pound, but upward pressure on the US dollar against each other. To maintain the fixed exchange rate, the central bank must intervene and sell foreign exchange to buy domestic currency. It has to create enough demand for the domestic currency to maintain the value upon which it is pegged. To do this, they sell US dollars on the market and buy Lebanese pound in an attempt to get an equilibrium price of 1 to 1,500. In order to maintain the peg, Lebanon must attract US dollars so it can then sell them on the market, because it can't print US dollars themselves. The burden of keeping the Lebanese pound and the dollar fell on the Lebanese central bank, Banque du Liban, which used its foreign currency reserves to defend the peg. But reserves are limited. They needed more US dollars. So how does a country like Lebanon attract the US dollars it needs in order to maintain the peg? Well, there are a few natural features of the Lebanese economy that help. First one is tourism. During the Civil War, over 1 million Lebanese left to find greener pastures and build new lives. These expats and their children visited Lebanon frequently from areas such as the Gulf, Canada, United States, Europe, and Australia, bringing back with them foreign currencies. Pre-pandemic tourism was nearly 20% of Lebanon's economy and represented massive inflows. Another source of inflow would be Lebanese working overseas, sending money back to their loved ones and relatives as a form of financial support, but it wasn't enough to maintain the peg. And here is where the Ponzi begins. Two things occurred. The government/central bank borrowed money at high rates from the rest of the world. Lebanese commercial banks promised high interest rates on deposits for Lebanese citizens at home and abroad, as well as international ones. These rates were well above market rates. As a result, the money flowed in. The central bank/government received money via loans from the rest of the world, and commercial banks received money via deposits. Take a look at the following email sent by a local Lebanese bank to a possible high net worth investor. You can see that the rates of return are extraordinary over such a short period of time. Now note, the ticket size is quite large, but as the banks became more desperate, they started to reduce that amount. Take a look at this WhatsApp message sent by a local Lebanese banker to a prospective client. We have new products for deposits with a minimum of $20 million, paying 14% annual rate. But now we're opening up this great offer for the general population at much smaller amounts, but only for dollars coming from outside Lebanon. We put your money with the central bank and we don't know what it does with it, but rest assured that as far as you're concerned, the money is with our bank. I think it's important to note that this is not a joke. Such WhatsApp messages and emails were real and were floating around the Lebanese banking system. See, Lebanon's commercial banks use the US dollar flows from deposits to basically speculate on sovereign debt instruments issued by the central bank Banque du Liban. These debt instruments and the interests were significantly higher than the international markets. Private banks within Lebanon and the central bank, as well as the government, were in cahoots. This was the Ponzi Finance. Let me put it as simply as I can in an example. Let's say a Lebanese commercial bank offered 8% on deposits. They then took those inflows and lent it to the central bank, who were offering 12%. The commercial bank profited the difference, 12 minus 8, which equals 4%. The central bank then used that money to either prop up the currency, accrue more debt, or help political elites take a grip on the country's already thin resources. It also used the money to pay off outstanding debt payments from the new deposits it was receiving from its commercial banks. Commercial banks were doing the same with the new deposits they were receiving, robbing Peter to pay Paul. This led to Dan Azzi of Columbia's Business School terming the Lola. A Lola is a Lebanese dollar or a US dollar which is stuck in the banking system. Really, just a computer entry with no corresponding currency. The financial sector, the government, and its power brokers were making money doing really nothing. This is called rentier capitalism. It describes the economic practice of gaining large profits without contributing to society. A rentier is someone who earns income from capital without working. See, when banks are not motivated by lending to the economy to generate future assets and growth, this is called rentier capitalism. it also has another massive negative effect. Let's go back to Ziad and the hardware store. Let's say Ziad decided that rather than importing the screws, he wanted to make them in Lebanon, and as such goes to the bank for the loan. Banks in Lebanon did not have the incentives to lend to entrepreneurs like Ziad because they were earning better rates with less risk from the central bank. Most of the money the state collected through the bonds and deposits in the end was used to repay interest rather than build the assets of the nation state. See, accumulating debt and offering high rates of interest can be forgiven when the central bank and government use that money to build the infrastructure of the economy. Maintaining a high peg can also be advantageous when you use that high peg to import materials to build your economy for the long term. See, rather than invest in social welfare programs, rather than build public infrastructure such as roads, telco towers, universities, and hospitals, rather than build assets upon which you could stack against that debt, it chose to reward the elite, the bankers, the power brokers, and the factions, at the detriment of the working class, at the detriment of the Lebanese people, and it eventually crushed the Lebanese economy. Like any Ponzi scheme, things are okay until they're not. In 2019, shocks to the system really started to eventuate. The complete collapse of Syria and a wave of refugees strained the Lebanese economy. There was a delay in the 2019 budget, sanctions on Hezbollah, an escalation of conflict with Israel. The writing was on the wall. And when writing's on the wall, it is the rich that usually leave first. Capital flight, that is money going outside of the country, at the beginning of 2019 had picked up, and deposits were dwindling. The smart money was realizing it was a Ponzi scheme, while the working class would suffer the consequences. In 2019, money was being transferred outside the country at a rate of $1 billion per month. In an attempt to ensure capital reserves were sufficient, banks started to implement withdrawal limits, but the wheels were falling off. Lebanon was then hit with the kitchen sink, the pandemic, the explosion at the Lebanese port, and social unrest. All meant that this Ponzi had well and truly collapsed. When looking back, the plight of Lebanon was predictable. The state borrowed from the central bank borrowed from local banks, all at unsustainable rates. Running out was a fait accompli. When the cash ran out, the entire structure came crashing down. Comedian Naeem Halawi summarizes it best. Pity the nation that earns lira and spends dollar. I leave you with the World Bank, who commented on the lost funds. These are the earnings by expats who toil in foreign lands. They are retirement funds for citizens and perhaps the sole resource for a dignified living. They are necessary financing for essential medical and education services that consecutive governments have failed to provide. They are funds to pay for electricity in light of the colossal failures in Electricité du Liban. Pity the nation. Pity Lebanon.